Thank you all for coming today. I hope you all got in okay yesterday and you all flew safely. I know a lot of us were delayed. So today we're going to talk about something that we're all very familiar with, but we do struggle to define it. We struggle to encourage it. We struggle to just understand what it really means. And yet it's a part of our every single day lives, whether it be our relationships with other human beings or our relationships with systems. So my name is Isaac Mosquera. I do container and serverless strategy at AWS.
And my name is Fernando Freire, and I'm a principal software engineer at Armory, building engineering teams working on Spinnaker and our hosted solutions.
And together we have about 30 years of platform development experience. And the one thing that we have learned in these years is that the features themselves that make up the platform are somewhat irrelevant, because what's more important than those features is actually the trust that we have with the teams that use those features, are the teams themselves, the DevOps teams, the leadership, and how we view the people around us. Ultimately, that is what drives those features, and depending on how we have that trust, those features manifest differently, and the users end up using the platform differently. So we're going to talk today about trust and how it affects these platforms.
And this wouldn't be a conference talk if we didn't start out with a definition with some nice colors, a nice little slide design. So we're going to start off building a shared understanding of what trust is. So the way we're going to define it today and the way we're going to frame the rest of this conversation is around three key ideas: competency, empathy, and reliability. And these three things, you can execute on one of these three things and you can build some semblance of trust, but it's the combination of all three of these things that are going to make you more effective in the way that you roll out your CD strategy in your organizations. So trust is that bedrock that we need to rely on in order to make more complex interactions, right? Have more complex experiences with our users. So let's start off with the first one. So when we combine sound reasoning, effective communication, and the ability to perform some kind of task, we're signaling to others that we're competent, right? You trust people that are competent. You may not feel this way personally, but we have an institution already in the real world that does this for us, which is the Department of Motor Vehicles. So you need to understand how a car works and how it runs on the road. You need to be able to demonstrate that competency on some kind of written test and an actual driving test with a DMV. And then you need to be able to demonstrate that in person. We do that in software as well, right? It's not just the DMV, right? It's not just these real world things. If you're building a continuous delivery platform, whether it's Spinnaker, whether it's Jenkins, whether it's any custom internal tooling, if it behaves in unexpected ways, if it doesn't communicate what it's doing effectively, and then it doesn't deploy well at all, right? It doesn't perform its core function, then you're not going to trust the platform that you're building.
So the second part is empathy. So we'll talk a little bit about empathy. It's a little bit trickier than competency and reliability, right? Because we don't talk about that very much as engineers or folks in IT. We talk a lot more about the first and the third one. But the second one's actually pretty critically important because it manifests itself in those features that we were talking about earlier. And so empathy is the ability to care about somebody else's situation. And so this, I think we're all familiar with, the at here. Who uses Slack? First, hands. Do we all use Slack? Okay. So we're all familiar with this one, right? So this is showing a lack of empathy. What this shows is that I care about my needs being met way before you, and that I don't even care about what you're doing, right? I need information right now, right? Here's another one that is outside of the IT world, but I really like this example because the first example was a negative example. Here's a positive example of empathy. Now, this isn't a trick. This says, don't buy this jacket. This is a Patagonia ad that ran sometime way back. I don't know when. And this ran before Black Friday. And they meant it. They don't want you to buy that jacket. In fact, they want you to stay home, and they don't want you to buy things on Black Friday because they believe that reusing, recycling will leave Earth inhabitable Earth for our children, right? So they have empathy for people who aren't even born yet. Now, it's not all altruistic, of course, right? They are building trust in a brand. They know that eventually you'll come back and buy, but they're foregoing their immediate needs to meet the needs of other people. And they know they'll get the users back, and they're building trust within their brand in doing so by showing a lot of empathy.
And the last pillar that we're going to be focusing on today is reliability. It's our ability to do something consistently over time. So think about when you're using your deployment systems, is it deploying successfully 5 out of 10 times, 7 out of 10 times, or 9 out of 10 times, or is it doing it 10 out of 10 times? If it's doing it 100% of the time, then you're considering your platform to be reliable, and you're going to be able to build up that trust over time. And it works the same with people, right? If people are consistently able to communicate requirements, that they're consistently able to work with you and demonstrate, again, that competency and that empathy, then you're gonna trust them better over time.
So let's talk about what happens when we don't have trust and what is the result, because this is something that we've all felt in our systems. So one of the things that we observed is that we build systems of enforcement instead of enablement. And so we know what these systems are like. Who has ever heard in IT of a change control board, like the CCRB, right? Those are not systems of enablement. Those are systems of enforcement. There are rules that we must enforce onto people. I think we could all agree that no one's really happy to go through that process, right? But there's other processes that are good, again, showing a positive example, right? So pull requests, right? We've all gone through pull requests. It's where you get a peer to look at your code. That's something I actually enjoy, and I do it because I need it. It enables me to feel safe when I'm going to push code out into production. Now, if you look at the systems of enforcement, right, when there's lack of trust, is I don't trust you to do the things that you need to do, I don't trust you to take care of security or architecture, and you build things like a CCRB, what ends up happening is that you start incentivizing the wrong behavior, start batching up deployments, right? Maybe we don't break things into monoliths that should be that should be microservices, right? I'm not saying that's the case for all architectures, but if it needs to be a microservice, but you're keeping it as a monolith to get through your other systems of accountability and enforcement, right? We incentivize the wrong behavior.
The next thing that happens when we break down trust is we create a zero tolerance posture towards failure. So there's a very famous quote from Werner Vogel's CTO at Amazon that says, everything fails all the time. So when you start to have a breakdown in trust, you have users that don't trust the system that you're building, you're going to start optimizing for behavior that minimizes the probability of failure, because you want to create that trust, right? That misguided notion that you want to be able to have something that works every time. And so the way that manifests itself is you start to manage risk. So you start to minimize the probability of failure when the equation is really one of two things, right? It's the probability of failure and the impact of that failure. So if you have your website going down, let's use an example. Well, we're not going to use this example. We're going to talk about a separate example. Let's say you're running a cloud service that has 3 nines of availability, and maybe one time out of every 3 years it goes down, and everybody's relying on that service. If that service goes down, the impact of failure is going to be pretty large, even though the probability of that failure was pretty small. But if you spend all of your engineering effort trying to minimize that probability, the impact is still going to make it really painful. So we'll talk later when we start talking about strategies for fostering trust. We'll talk about how you can minimize impact rather than minimizing the probability of that failure.
So the other thing that happens when we don't have trust is we suffer from low engagement, right? So how many times have you all answered a survey about your deployment strategy or your CD platform? The DevOps team sends one out. Have you ever sent one out, or have ever received a survey from a centralized platform? By show of hands. Yeah, so, and how many times as a result of that survey has nothing changed? Like, do you think that things change when you get this survey? No, they typically don't. And that is the gap, the trust gap that we have, right? This happens all the time. I work with a lot of organizations where they send out those surveys, and then these developers and development teams feel unheard, right? And then they have low engagement and user retention, meaning they're not wanting to use the platform, right? And when you take the power away from them, when you take voice away from these developers or development teams, well, they'll go find somewhere else where they do have a voice and they do have power.
And so a consequence of that is leading to introducing overhead, right? If you have low engagement, you're going to start to build systems that gate access to resources. You're going to start making sure that you prevent bad behavior from happening rather than working with your teams to empower the kind of behavior that you want to see. So think about a time when you've wanted to explore a new piece of infrastructure, or a new tool, right? Let's say you wanted to adopt, the latest and greatest from AWS, but your organization has denied the ability to stand up that resource. That's an act of introducing overhead just to prevent bad behavior from happening, rather than the inverse, right? Where we want to empower that exploration, empower the ability to find better ways of delivering software, so that we end up with a better product at the end of the day.
But no matter how hard you try, people will find a way. Nature finds a way. People will find a way around all of the constraints, the enforcements, the lack of trust, everything you build, right? If people want to get their job done and need to get their job done, and your tool is in their way, they'll go around your tool. And guess what? They're going to build their own systems. And now you end up with 3 new problems, right? The first is, in order to get them off of their system, you have to understand what they built in the first place. So now you're spending time learning what they built. The second time is you have to debate the merits of what they built. Maybe they actually built something better than you, right? Let's assume that they didn't, though, for this case. And the third is, now you have to bring them back into your platform, right? So no matter how hard you want to constrain and reduce other people to your system, right? It's just creating a lot more work for you. So if you start at the very beginning and you trust who they are and if they've shown competency, empathy, and reliability, it'll make your life a lot easier if you can bring them in. And we'll talk more about how to do that in actually the next section.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about what trust is and what happens when it starts to break down. So let's figure out ways that we can enable trust. And the first thing to call out is that you can't build trust. Trust is given between 2 parties. So the best that we can do is enable environments and situations where trust can happen and can foster over time. So before we dive into strategies, we want you to know that everything that we're going to put on here will be on the slides. You can check it out later. We'll include a couple of links as well for some practical examples so that you can take this back to your teams. But overall, the high-level themes to keep in mind is that not all of the strategies that we're going to call out are going to work for your organization. Keep in mind the size of your team, the number of teams that you're supporting, and what your risk tolerance is, right? So if you have a zero tolerance policy of production going down, or if you have some other constraint that you're working with, some of these strategies are going to work better or worse. And the best advice that we can give is to choose the smallest combination of things to foster trust, right? Start small and build up over time. Don't try and implement all 15 or 20 strategies at once. You'll end up burning out and losing faith in the process, right? So we'll talk about the first one here.
Yeah, so the first thing is being able to communicate and establish clear values. We see this a lot where, we have a value of being honest or doing the best you can. Those are values for sure, but they don't really tell developers how to behave, right? And most of the time, the developers or even the DevOps folks building those platforms have no idea what the trade-offs are. They're making trade-offs in a vacuum without really understanding the values of leadership. So if you're in a leadership position, establishing and communicate these values is really important. Typically, it's kind of like even overstatements. So maybe build versus buy, right? Or buy over build, or open source versus vendors, or vendors versus open source. Whatever it may be, just make sure that it's a very clear kind of trade-off decision that you're making and you're communicating to your organization, right? So we all remember Facebook's, go fast and break things, or build fast and break things, right? That was a very clear kind of value system in saying, hey, it's actually okay if we lose a little bit of reliability as long as we're moving faster. Right? And so all these kind of messages help communicate to your organization why decisions are being made, because I can tell you that there's nothing more frustrating than having a decision being made that you disagree with and you have no idea why it was made that way. So the quicker you can establish these values with your teams and have buy-in, the rest will come a lot easier.
So the next way that we can enable trust is by leveraging other trustworthy sources, right? So this might be a little bit counterintuitive. How can I borrow somebody else's trust? But it can work when implemented in the right way, right? So think about all of the open source communities and open source tools that you use today that you have trust in. You have trust that those communities are competent, they're empathetic to their users' needs, and they're reliable. They do the thing that they that they do very well. So leverage those open source communities, pull those tools into your workspace rather than trying to build all of that trust from ground zero or foster that trust. So, if the opportunity is to choose a Spinnaker or a Jenkins or an Argo, choose those tools as the basis for your platform, and then start to build all of the custom features on top of that for yourselves. If you start from scratch, you're going to have to demonstrate that competency to your users first, and then be able to build that reliability and empathy after that. So then the next one we're going to talk about is demonstrating paths to competence, right? So trust is a two-way street. We think about, trust, or demonstrating that trustworthiness through competency, empathy, reliability. If the rules are explicit, like with the DMV, it's very easy to know when we're, in a situation where we trust each other. So there's a couple of different strategies that we can do within that, right? Within demonstrating that competency, and the first is providing structured feedback loops.
Yeah, so when you provide structured feedback loops, ways to get back and enable your users to have a voice, right? It's pretty important because it forces you to sit down and think about how people are going to have that voice and be part of your development process. So it's really important to have this structured feedback loop and not just kind of like an open question of like, well, tell me what to do next. But instead, go through your value system. Go through, are you meeting your goals with your users, and understand where the gaps are. Where do you need to iterate next, right? And it goes both ways too, right? Because on the other side, the users of your platform also need to be able to be empathetic and to be able to communicate clearly. So it's an opportunity for them to communicate clearly with you through a structured feedback loop.
And then the culmination of those couple of strategies is in defining a clear roadmap, right? So if you have a clear value system, you provided a structured way for people to tell you about their needs, then you can demonstrate that empathy and that competency by communicating that roadmap out, right? So if you know that you have 3 sets of teams that you're trying to onboard, and they're all using different technologies, you need to find a way within that value system to communicate, here's how we're going to approach these things. Or even more explicit, here are the things that we're not going to do. Because even if you say this is a thing that we're not going to do, your teams know how to operate off of that information, right? As long as they know where they stand, they're able to move within that space, within that value system. And that kind of transparency increases the reliability that you're going to have those people come back to you and come tell you their needs in the future, right? Even if they may not like the answer ahead of time. So then the next thing that we want to talk about is minimizing that impact of failure, right? So if we think back to risk, right? Risk is the composition or the product of the probability of failure occurring with the impact of that failure. So if our strategy so far has been to minimize the probability of that failure occurring, we should instead try and minimize the impact, right? So find ways that you can work with your teams to test out new ideas within your platform. So if you have a team that wants to explore a brand new technology, maybe a function as a service platform, you want to work with them to create a pilot use case, have a hypothesis. Is this going to increase our deployment velocity? Is this going to increase our ability to bring new product to market? Great, let's test that hypothesis out and let's structure it in a way that we can learn from it and then incorporate it into our roadmap. And that way, we're not defining a multi-quarter strategy where we're going to support functions as a service, and then we're going to roll it out to the organization. Then we're going to say, great, go ahead and use it, right? Because at that point, the probability of failure is pretty high, and the impact is also pretty high. So the simplest thing that you could do to get started today as well is to implement a contributing.md file, right? So if it's a single project or you have multiple projects, this is the best way to start incorporating your teams into your CD strategy. So give your users a way to contribute back. Even if you're a small team, this actually works best when you're a small team, because you can define exactly the ways in which you want people to come and provide input to the platform that you're building. So there's a couple of very simple strategies. You can add this file to your repository, and then you can also demonstrate empathy and reliability by consistently engaging with those pull requests, right? So if you have people that are contributing to your project and they're adding functions as a service, they're adding support for containers, they're adding support for the latest and greatest VM product that gets released, great. You can start to engage with them, understand their needs, incorporate that into the platform. And now you have invested users, right? They're putting skin in the game, and they're more likely to trust the platform because they've had a hand in building it as well.
I like latest and greatest VM product. So one of the last ones here is separating out controls from best practices. What we see in a lot of platforms is that they combine both, right? One is actually a need and one is actually a want. Best practices are a desire, right? Where controls, regulations, those are a need. We need to abide by the rules and the laws that we have. So many times we see platform teams take best practices and combine them with controls in order for them to get adopted, right? So for example, you must use this tool in this way because otherwise we won't meet our compliance regulation. But those two statements don't necessarily need to be combined. So if we can separate out best practices, things like rollbacks, progressive delivery, what else? Canarying, right? Right? When we can separate out those things from the compliance area, right? And let developers use the best tools that they can to actually perform delivery and deployments from those controls, then we can have an honest conversation about, is this even really a best practice? Because many times what we end up doing is making everybody in a large organization use a tool that is a best practice for one group, but is absolutely not a best practice for another group. How we use those VMs, how we use those containers, how we use functions as a service is very, very different. So we can't just constrain them all to the same thing, even though the controls and the compliance is always the same, right? Compliance rules don't change per the infrastructure that we use. So we have to be very, very diligent in this area. Otherwise, users will get upset. Will actually, have all of the impact that we had, the negative impact that we had at the very beginning of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, right, trust is the combination of these three items: competency, empathy, reliability. If you haven't heard us say it enough, you're going to hear us say it probably a few more times. But we've given you a number of strategies that you can implement with your teams today to help build these three pillars up and encourage you to have a stronger CD strategy within your organization. So with that, we'd like to thank you for coming out to the talk, and we'll open it up for any questions, any and all questions that you have. And maybe we'll get Q&A from the virtual stuff too, maybe? Yeah? Okay, yes, thank you.
So any questions from the audience here?
You mentioned the comparing MD file.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what's in there? Like when I see that, I think of like an open source project.
Totally, yeah. So.
Are you talking about something different?
No. So yeah, use that example from open source and apply it internally to your organization. There's actually a really neat organization called the Inner Source Commons, which is basically a way of applying open source principles inside of your organization. You don't have to go the full 9 yards and implement like a full open source strategy internally, but adopting techniques from the Inner Source Commons are a great way to start collaborating with more teams within your organization. So this could be as simple as like all pull requests have to be in the conventional commit format, or they could be as complex as we're only going to contribute functions or strategies within like a certain set of technologies. But as long as you're clear in describing that intent, then you're at least setting the stage for people to contribute, right? And you're starting that conversation ahead of time.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like the one thing that you'll want to kind of Google is inner source. There's a lot of content out there for inner sourcing inside of your organization, a private repo. And then why this is so important is because as a centralized team, it's hard if you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of developers, you can't scale to that size on your own. It's just impossible. So having this contributing MD allows you to create a process, a scalable process that invites everybody in. So you kind of have, it's two things. One, it helps you get your job done, but two, it helps foster that communication and trust in a way that you couldn't otherwise. So in a scalable way, that's really what we're after here, scalability. Any other questions? Oh, one from the...
In-person question?
Yeah, you mentioned building off of trust open source projects as a foundation. How do you go about evaluating that trust? Okay, this is a good option for building a good foundation.
you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think if we're going to evaluate the trust, we landed on competency, empathy, and reliability, right? Has this community demonstrated in the past, reliable activity? Are they empathetic, right? And then are they competent? And I think what we're seeing now more so than ever before in open source community is that middle point. We actually probably should have moved it to the front, because empathy now is something that we're seeing as a critical part of open source communities. But I think that's the way you go to evaluating. Now, none of us can predict the future. Absolutely, things go away, right? And open source projects go away. But the more that they can demonstrate those three areas, the better, I believe that the higher likelihood that they'll stick around. And I see a lot of that especially in the Linux Foundation, a lot of those projects there. They're really trying to foster the empathy part. How we collaborate and work with each other on particular projects is really, really important, and that's ultimately what will make it survive. And then, of course, who's a part of that community, right? That's the competency part. Are these people who have demonstrated, expertise in the particular area, right? And Kubernetes obviously comes to mind, right? Obviously, the people who created had experience with containers. The community's very empathetic, and they've been very reliable in terms of producing great software.
I believe we had a question from the virtual attendees.
Are there case studies or articles out there to learn from folks taking these approaches inside of organizations?
That's a great question. So we'll repeat it. Are there case studies where some of these techniques have been used within organizations? I'm going to fall back again to the Inner Source Commons project. That really is a great resource for understanding how organizations have leveraged this stuff successfully internally. And then we can post a few more resources with the slides that talk a little bit more about some of the other techniques that we were mentioning today. Awesome. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, y'all.
Enjoy the rest of the day.